Ultimately, it depends on how you interpret politics. I think the emerging groupthink view is that Trump is effectively finished, that if you look at the polling, Biden's now averaging a fairly comfortable lead of 5 points, and that Trump's mishandling of the crisis has really damaged his chances in those key swing states where Biden has consistently been polling now ahead of Trump. But of course, politics at its core is often not about lofty appeals to humanitarianism, but is about the attribution of blame. You know, one of the reasons that I thought Trump was going to win in 2016 was because if you drill down into those same polls and you looked at how his key groups had felt about the previous crisis and had also felt about these new, more salient issues like immigration and national security, that you could see this growing divergence. And that really what counted for Trump. And this time around too, I mean, if you were being critical of Biden's chances, you would say his lead on the economy over Trump is still not as strong as it should be. Trump is still most trusted to handle things like jobs and the overall management of the economy. But also further than that, what we're seeing in the US now is this fundamental and perhaps permanent realignment around China, that Americans over the last 2 to 3 months have become less trusting of China, more likely to say they hold unfavorable views of China, more likely to say that key supply chains should be brought back from China. So all of that is going to underpin this big debate in the autumn, which is going to be about America's relationship with China. And of course, Trump is going to press that button. We all know he's going to press that button. And I think we'll see something of a verbal arms race between Trump and Biden on that. So I personally still think it's a coin toss. And Trump, as we know, is a pretty good campaigner. He might not get the mass rallies this time because of the social distancing and so on, but I think we can expect some surprises. And his electorate, lastly, is pretty loyal. I mean, if you look at how Republicans, evangelicals, and white working class voters with no college degree feel about the Trump presidency and feel about his handling of this crisis, then you're looking at still, some pretty high numbers. So I think this is still a coin toss. Zone will survive this crisis, and as Jean Monnet once said, it's often during moments of crisis that the European Union will become more integrated and will become closer, and that's true also, I think, of the eurozone. But what this crisis has done underneath that, like the Great Recession, the crisis before it, and also the refugee crisis, is it's exposed some of these latent and sharp divides, which crudely put, between the North and the South on economic redistribution, and between East and West on identity and social liberalism. And I think the Eurozone is now rapidly approaching this crossroads where it's going to be unsustainable to paper over those divides with a little bit more economic investment and a little bit more triumphalist talk about Europe meeting this moment of truth. The reality, as we know from the economic data, and I would argue from the political data on levels of trust and populism and protectionism and so forth, is that the Italians and the Spanish and the Greeks are having a very different experience of this crisis than the more economically secure, affluent North. And the longer term prospects for Southern Europe, something I've been arguing for quite a long time, are not good. It is going to be very difficult, for example, for the Italians to invest in their own economy and to get the political stability that they will need longer term if they're going to turn the ship around. And whether you look at how Italians are feeling about the European Union or the Eurozone, the one point I would argue when it comes to this crisis is that Italy will not only leave this crisis as a poorer Eurozone state, but it will also leave this crisis as a more Eurosceptic Eurozone state. And this is within the context of a number of big challenges that are now going to bear down on the Eurozone. It isn't just Brexit. It isn't just heightened Euroscepticism in Italy. It's also these intergenerational divides over employment prospects, these north-south divides over economic redistribution, and more generally, the fragmentation of Europe's political systems. We've seen them become over time less stable as more incoherent and sometimes often quite inexperienced coalitions have taken the place of those more predictable and reliable, strong political coalitions that we saw in the past. So I am more skeptical about the future of the eurozone. I think it will survive, but I would not be surprised if, a decade from now we are looking at a contraction of some sort. Some of the arguments about this crisis have been quite sensationalist. We've talked about the end of globalization. We've talked about the end of liberalism. And, I think that's really pushed some of the claims too far. I mean, if we wanted to interrogate the evidence, one way we could do that is look back at the previous crisis and say, well, what can we learn from the Great Recession when we come to think about the Great Lockdown? And of course, in some ways, they're very different. The Great Recession was really a double crisis. It was political and economic. The Great Lockdown is really a triple crisis that cuts across politics, economics, and health. But I think it's still a much more useful starting point than this sort of sensationalist talk about, sort of end of a paradigm type moment. And that crisis really gave us some interesting insights. Firstly, it showed the extent to which these moments don't really create instability, but they exacerbate many of the underlying social and economic divides that have been a long time coming. And so I think what's interesting about the Great Lockdown is, in effect, it's going to continue many of the divides that had been pushed further open by the Great Recession. I think it's also going to fundamentally transform the relationship between the citizen and the state. I think if you take a long-term view of this, you could argue that the 1929 Wall Street crash really signaled the failure of the markets. That paved the way for the return of the state through the New Deal in America and welfare states in Europe. Fast forward to the 1970s, see the failure of the state, the exhausted state, unable to be efficient and effective anymore. That paves the way for Thatcherism and Reaganism and the sort of free market capitalism model on steroids almost. You then fast forward to 2008, and this time it's a turn of the markets to overreach, and you see that moment pave the way alongside the Great Lockdown for what we're seeing now, which is a return of the state. Much bigger governments, more intervention, more investment. Look at the UK, where I am right now. 1 in 3 private sector employees effectively dependent on the state to get through this crisis. And that's also going to have an intergenerational element too. If you look, for example, at millennials and my students, Generation Z, the Zoomers, for that generation, they have now come of age, having watched the state effectively rescue society during the Great Recession and then during the Great Lockdown. What period effect, what cohort effect is that going to have longer term as we have younger voters looking not to individual responsibility or to business, but looking to the state for answers? I think that's a really interesting question. And also one thing to consider too is that by the time my students turn 25, they'll already have lived through 2 financial crises and a global pandemic, which I think also is going to raise some really interesting questions about how the underlying foundations of politics might change in the future. Which political parties and ideologies are they going to look to resolve these underlying issues? We've become used to politics now for the last decade turning towards those identity questions: immigration, borders, multiculturalism, European integration. That really was the sort of the agenda of the 2010s. I think if you look ahead at the 2020s against the backdrop of this crisis, I would personally expect the big economic questions to come back: redistribution, taxation, inequality, all of those issues, in a way, the founding issues of politics, the traditional issues of politics. And what does that mean? Well, perhaps it means that social democracy and centre-left politics might find a way back into the room, which has been in crisis for a period of time. Maybe that means the green movements in Europe that we've been seeing doing very well in northern European states, maybe this will help them as well. Alternatively, maybe this new agenda will mix with those potent issues of migration and terrorism and borders, and perhaps that will continue this populist moment that we're in. So I think there are sort of many different spin-offs from this crisis. It is going to challenge many of our priors when it comes to trying to make sense of politics. And one of the things I've been quite struck by is now the number of economists who say that actually they can no longer ignore politics and political science, which is great for my discipline because political science is back in the room in a big way. as a lot of our traditional models now need to expand and need to think about, well, actually, why are people voting the way that they do, and how do these crises impact things like inequality and wealth and so forth and so on. Intergenerational element to this crisis is both fascinating and worrying. I would argue that for the first time really in the post-war period, we are now seeing more recent generations questioning the intergenerational contract, the idea that each generation should be a little bit more secure, a little bit more affluent than the one that went before, that they're questioning that contract like never before. If you look, for example, at survey data, as I do, one of the interesting and striking things about millennials is that compared to their baby boomer parents and compared to their silent or greatest generation grandparents, they are now more likely, much more likely to say they would have rather grown up when their parents were children at that particular time, that they have now become much more convinced that their generation is going to be poorer and is going to be more insecure, more left behind than their earlier generations. And I think that's going to have actually really profound effects. One example, we've spent a lot of time in political science thinking about these value divides and the polarization that seems to be sweeping through many of our democracies. And one of the key arguments there is that what really matters is value change, how our values are changing. And in brief, one of the fashionable arguments now is that it was really in the 60s and the 70s that the baby boomers who had the economic security, who had the expansion of higher education, were then able to not worry about those basic needs over economic and physical security that were at the bottom of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that famous triangle of human motivation, that once you satisfy your basic needs, you move up the triangle. And baby boomers were really the first generation to start to indulge in those higher level concerns over self-esteem, social status, recognition. And of course, that had profound political effects. It led them to engage in debates over minority rights, environmentalism, internationalism, cosmopolitanism, all of these things that the great liberal revolution of the 60s and 70s gave birth to. What's different now about the millennials and the slightly younger Zoomers is they are not going to grow up amid the economic security that their baby boomer parents and perhaps baby boomer grandparents in some cases had. And so that will probably have some pretty profound political effects. It will probably push them either further to the left, because we know economic hardship tends to be a bigger and stronger predictor of support for left-wing parties. It may make them more dependent on the state and less reliant on the markets, but it might also push them into apathy, simply giving up on politics altogether. For example, my students will often say, I simply don't think that national governments are capable of resolving the climate change crisis. And you see this push into social movement activism, non-electoral activism. So I think we are going to see some pretty strong intergenerational effects, and how governments can try and speak to that, I think will be absolutely fascinating, whether it's about the tuition fee debate, whether it's actually about skills and training. We are going to have, I think, a renewed international debate about meritocracy and about the failures of meritocracy, the way in which we have now constructed societies that only seem to award esteem and recognition to university graduates, whereas those millennials and Zoomers who choose to perhaps enter into technical and non-university professions and occupations are perhaps understandably questioning whether they are valued members of society. And this coronavirus crisis has interestingly thrown light on many of those sections within our society, many of those workers who we now realize we are actually heavily dependent upon, who have not gone through the traditional meritocratic route into what you might call achievement society. So I think this is going to be, absolutely fascinating, and it will have effects. And one of the last points I'd say is always remember the political effects of crises are downstream. You won't see them for a few years. It's like trying to predict the political effects of the Great Recession in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers collapse. You didn't really see the political effects, the great turbulence of the 2010s until a few years afterwards. And it's only now in 2020 that we can look back at the 2010s, and we can see all of the turbulence, the rise of populism in Europe, the vote for Brexit, the vote for Trump, populism in Latin America and parts of Asia. And not all of those things were caused by the financial crisis, but it was certainly helpful in cultivating the soil for many of those movements. And it may be in the same way that as we look forward into the 2020s, we really don't get a full grasp of the political effects until we're much further into that decade. Well, I think when it comes to China, if you look at the surveys and the polls and sort of the public mood around China, which is something I spend my time doing, is sort of using these big surveys to look at how things are actually changing. China's obviously had a very difficult crisis, and I think there's an argument to be made that this crisis has fundamentally and permanently changed the way in which lots of people think about China. So whether you look at surveys in the United States, whether you look at surveys in India, Australia, the United Kingdom, you can see a much stronger dose of skepticism, and in some cases open criticism seeping into populations. For example, Americans have become much less trusting of President Xi, have become much more open in saying we should not be economically dependent upon China. We should bring back the production and manufacture of medical supplies. I think that nearshoring debate is going to really accelerate in the coming years. You've seen the Australians calling for an open, independent investigation into the crisis, and then having to face the economic consequences of that. You've seen the UK now moving back from its willingness to cooperate with China over 5G, and you're seeing Boris Johnson coming under enormous pressure from his conservative backbenchers, and I might add, voters overall, as this debate about redefining that relationship begins to heat up. Now, how far could that go? Well, we've seen examples of American senators introducing legislation that would suggest that if China does not cooperate, then there'll be effectively sanctions against China. We've seen people around number 10 saying that we need to now question the reliance of specific sectors on China, for example, higher education and Chinese international students. And we've seen more generally across Europe, lots of politicians, particularly on the populist end, for example, if you look at Italy, saying actually the initial diplomatic efforts of China to send aid and to send supplies hasn't really cut through, and those politicians saying, they do not want to be a pawn in this wider geopolitical struggle. So I think, at broad level, the point that I would make is that if China is not careful, it risks moving from being seen largely as an economic and trade competitor to being seen as what we might call a systemic threat. And we haven't really talked about systemic threats in this way since the end of the Cold War. We've talked about militant Islamism and terrorism, but that's not quite the same thing. We haven't talked about a broader ideological systemic threat to what you might call the Western liberal order. And I think even though elites have talked about that, and it's certainly been an elite level discussion, it hasn't cut through into the public mindset. And the interesting and perhaps also challenging aspect of this crisis is that it now may have pushed a larger number of ordinary people into viewing China in that way. And that will have all kinds of consequences going forward. Likely that this crisis will bring back the debate over inequality in a big way. We already know from the research on previous pandemics that they tend to lead to a significant increase in the Gini coefficient, the sort of measure of inequality in societies. And we can already see during the coronavirus crisis, as we've got new research now coming up to the surface, that this is primarily hitting the very same groups that were being left behind even before the Great Recession, but those very same groups which have also been driving much of the disruptive political change of the last decade or so. Lower income groups, non-college educated workers, frontline, blue collar, low-skilled service sector employees, not only more likely to lose their jobs, but also more likely to hold the underlying health conditions that will amplify the health effects of the crisis. And I think more generally, one byproduct of this crisis, if we are not careful, is that it is going to lead left behind workers to question the economic settlement like never before. We already know that large majorities of people within those groups believe that the system is rigged, believe that the economic system is rigged against them, that the odds are stacked against them. And if you look, for example, at how some countries have reacted to this crisis, France, Denmark, and Poland saying, well, actually, they're not going to bail out industries that choose to locate in offshore tax havens. Or if you look at the debate over Richard Branson in the United Kingdom, or if you look at the way in which one of the early stories in this crisis in the United States was the sort of, the wealthy New Yorkers moving off to their second home in the Hamptons. And you've had this debate that's sort of at a very crude level reflected in the, middle classes drinking quarantinis and the blue collar workers being on the front line. Symbolically, this could become very important. And, in the early days, the self-isolation and the quarantine was compulsory. Over the longer term, it will become voluntary, and then it will become an economic luxury. And that is where you may begin to see these groups having fundamentally different experiences of this crisis. As you get the sort of achievement society, the professional middle classes, Zooming, being much more flexible, being much more independent, and you get those key groups that have driven much of the political change over recent years, including, for example, Boris Johnson's majority. I mean, I've just done a lot of work on that election, and that was the first election really in post-war British political history when low-income voters sided in a much bigger way with the Conservative Party than they did with the Labour Party. And many of those voters are now getting hit very hard by the current crisis. This moment, I think, might amplify some of those trends. And that's why I do think it's really important. And the inequality debate, I suspect, will come back with a vengeance alongside those questions around economic redistribution and wealth.